It happened in less than a day. On June 26, 2025, Canadian lawmakers passed a single piece of legislation that may have just rewritten the rules of North American agricultural trade. The new law, SC 2025 Chapter 1, is short, sharp, and absolute. It bans Canadian negotiators from offering any concessions in dairy, poultry, or eggs during future trade talks. Not just in the upcoming USMCA review, not just with the United States, ever. For Canada, it's a declaration of sovereignty. For U.S. farmers, it's a disaster in slow motion. 7 states, from the plains of North Dakota to the dairy barns of Wisconsin and the apple orchards of New York, now face a hard ceiling on market access to their #1 foreign buyer. It's not just about lost sales. It's about losing the single most reliable, profitable, and geographically close export market they have. And the worst part? This fight didn't begin with Canada's vote last week.
Wow.
Its
That is
roots
a hard
run through years of
That is a hard act to
dispute,
follow. Thank you, Sonia.
retaliatory
Thank you,
tariffs,
Victor,
and political
for all the
grandstanding
service
on both
to
sides
Canadian
of the
sport,
border.
to global
Former President Donald Trump has called the law a total betrayal. But as you'll see, this story is bigger than one politician's outrage. This is about the future of the border's breadbasket and the collision course it's now on. The core of this crisis comes down to a deceptively simple change in Canadian law and a policy framework known as supply management. The legislation, SC 2025 Chapter 1, was passed by Canada's Parliament and signed into law on June 26, 2025. Its text is blunt. Canadian trade negotiators are prohibited from making any concessions in the dairy, poultry, or egg sectors during trade negotiations. That prohibition is binding, regardless of who's in power or what the political climate is. It's the successor to a previous bill, C-282, which died in early 2025 when Parliament dissolved for elections. Both bills were built with the same goal: lock in supply management as a permanent, non-negotiable part of Canadian agricultural policy. So, what is supply management? It's a system designed to keep domestic production in balance with domestic demand. It sets quotas for farmers, guarantees minimum prices, and slaps high tariffs, often 200 to 300%, on imports above agreed limits. For American exporters, this means that any dairy product beyond the small quota allowed under the USMCA deal is essentially priced out of the Canadian market. Back in 2020, USMCA, or CUSMA as Canada calls it, granted the U.S. modest extra access to Canada's dairy market. But American producers quickly accused Canada of gaming the system. Ottawa allocated much of that access to Canadian processors, leaving less room for U.S. exporters to directly serve Canadian retailers. The U.S. challenged this twice under USMCA's dispute process. In 2022, Washington won, forcing Ottawa to adjust its quota allocation. But in 2023, the second case went Canada's way, with a panel ruling that Ottawa's new system complied with the agreement. That effectively froze progress on the issue. Now, with SC 2025 C1 in place, the matter isn't just stalled, it's sealed. Even if the U.S. pushes for more dairy access in the 2026 USMCA review, Canadian officials can't even negotiate on it without breaking their own law. The stakes are massive because Canada is one of America's top 2 agricultural export markets every single year. In 2024, U.S. farm exports to Canada totaled around $29.5 billion, representing 16.7% of all American agricultural exports. And it's not just bulk commodities, it's high-value consumer-ready goods like cheese, yogurt, apples, beef, and processed foods. 7 states are particularly vulnerable. North Dakota, roughly 70% of its exports go to Canada, heavily in grains, feed, and meat. South Dakota, 45% dependency, including beef, pork, and dairy products. Maine, 42% dependency, with dairy, seafood, and cold chain logistics critical to the state's economy. Michigan, a hub for processed foods and beverages, deeply integrated with Ontario's retail network. Wisconsin, the U.S. dairy capital, directly hit by quota limits. Minnesota, grain, meat, and feed exports to Manitoba and Ontario. New York, cheese, apples, vegetables, and specialty foods destined for Canadian supermarkets. The new law also amplifies existing trade friction points. Canada's clean fuel regulations raise transportation costs for cross-border shipments. Its fertilizer emission targets create uncertainty for feed and grain exporters. And a front-of-package labeling rule for foods high in sugar, salt, or saturated fat adds compliance costs for American processed food companies trying to sell in Canada. For decades, Canada was the safe market, close, stable, and willing to pay for quality. With SC 2025 C1, that safe harbor just became a walled fortress. Let's be brutally honest. The outrage from Donald Trump and his allies today is politically convenient, but this crisis didn't appear out of thin air. It's the byproduct of years of mistrust, tariff battles, and strategic missteps, many of which began under his own watch. Back in 2018, the Trump administration imposed tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, citing national security. Ottawa saw it as both an economic slap and a diplomatic insult. Canada's response was swift and calculated. Retaliatory tariffs aimed directly at politically sensitive American exports, including yogurt, cheese, and other agricultural products. That chapter planted a seed in Canadian political thinking. If the U.S. can turn your farm sector into a bargaining chip, you make sure that bargaining chip disappears. Fast forward to 2020. The USMCA replaced NAFTA, giving U.S. dairy producers slightly more access to Canada's market. On paper, it looked like a win. In practice, Ottawa's quota allocation rules funneled much of that access to Canadian processors, limiting direct sales by U.S. exporters to Canadian retailers. The U.S. fought back. The first USMCA dispute in 2022 went in Washington's favor, forcing Canada to tweak its quota allocation. But the second case in 2023, Canada won. And with that victory, it locked in a system the U.S. couldn't easily challenge again. Now, SC 2025 C1 takes that defensive posture and cements it in law. It's not just a policy choice anymore, it's a legislative barrier. Even if Canada's Prime Minister wanted to trade away a little more market access in dairy or poultry to get concessions from Washington in another area, they legally can't. From Canada's perspective, it's a smart move. They've preempted the 2026 USMCA review by removing their most valuable concession from the table before the talks even begin. From the U.S. perspective, it's a nightmare. One less card to play in negotiations, one more reason to consider hardball tactics. The economic stakes are huge. The U.S. Dairy Export Council estimates that without expanded access to Canada, American producers could lose out on hundreds of millions of dollars in potential revenue over the next decade, and dairy is just the start. Poultry and egg producers face identical barriers. Even beef and pork exporters are uneasy, especially after Canada temporarily banned imports from a major U.S. pork facility in March 2025 over a sanitary dispute. This isn't just about farmers, it's about entire rural economies. When export growth stalls, the effects ripple outward. Processors cut back production, trucking companies lose freight contracts, and small-town suppliers see their customer base shrink. Jobs disappear not only in agriculture, but in warehousing, logistics, and manufacturing linked to the farm economy. Politically, Trump is using the law to fuel his narrative that America's trade partners are taking advantage of the U.S. But here's the reality check. No U.S. president can force Canada to repeal SC 2025 C1 through trade talks alone. In Canadian politics, supply management isn't just economic policy, it's a cultural touchstone and a political red line. Repealing this law would be electoral suicide in rural Canada. So what are the options for Washington? Retaliatory tariffs are the obvious go-to, but history shows Canada can strike back with precision. During the 2018 tariff war, Ottawa targeted goods from swing states and politically influential regions, making sure the pain was felt where it could hurt U.S. lawmakers the most. If things escalate, This dispute could spill beyond agriculture into autos, energy, and other high-value sectors. That's a trade war neither side truly wants, but both sides might stumble into if political posturing overtakes pragmatic compromise. For American farmers, the message is grim. The most accessible, profitable foreign market they have is no longer a growth opportunity. They'll be told to find new markets in Asia or the Middle East, but those markets come with longer shipping routes, higher costs, and stiff competition from countries like New Zealand and Australia. For small and mid-sized farms in states like Wisconsin or upstate New York, those alternatives are often unrealistic. Their business models are built on quick, short-haul exports across the northern border. Remove that, and you remove the margin that keeps the lights on. At the end of the day, SC 2025-C1 isn't just a Canadian law, it's a wedge driven into one of the closest, most integrated agricultural trade relationships in the world. And unless both sides find a way to de-escalate, that wedge could split apart far more than just the dairy aisle. If you ask Canadian officials why they passed SC 2025-C1, the answer comes without hesitation. Protection. Not protectionism, they argue, but protection of rural livelihoods, domestic stability, and a food supply chain they control. To them, supply management is more than an economic framework. It's an insurance policy for family farms. It shields producers from the brutal price collapses that can wipe out entire sectors in countries with open markets. And unlike the US, where taxpayers fund billions in farm subsidies each year, Canada's system is designed so the costs are borne primarily by consumers, not government budgets. They see US demands for more access as a threat to their way of life. And in Canadian politics, that message resonates far beyond the Farm Belt. Rural ridings across provinces like Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia vote in near lockstep to defend the system, and politicians know it. That's why passing a law like SC 2025-C1 isn't politically risky in Canada. It's politically rewarding. South of the border, the narrative is starkly different. American farm groups, from the National Milk Producers Federation to the U.S. Dairy Export Council, call the law a blatant act of protectionism, locking out fair competition and breaking the spirit of USMCA's promise for progressive market access. They point to the fact that Canadian exporters enjoy relatively free entry into the U.S. for products like maple syrup, beer, canola oil, and processed foods. In Washington, the reaction is bipartisan. Farm state Democrats and Republicans alike see the law as a direct hit to their constituents' livelihoods. But the proposed responses vary. Some call for another USMCA dispute case, even knowing the legal pathway is murky. Others push for tariffs on Canadian agricultural products in retaliation. Trade lawyers, however, warn of a dangerous trap. While USMCA allows challenges to how quotas are administered, it doesn't require a country to offer market access in the first place. If Canadian law forbids it, the agreement can't override that domestic statute without triggering a much larger political conflict. And then there's the retaliation risk. Canada's performance during the 2018 to 2019 tariff standoff proved it knows how to play political hardball. Back then, Ottawa's counter tariffs targeted products from swing states and key congressional districts, ensuring maximum pressure on U.S. lawmakers. Lobster from Maine, whiskey from Kentucky, orange juice from Florida all found themselves in the crosshairs. If Washington escalates now, Canada could deploy the same playbook again. The public theater has already begun. At rallies, Donald Trump frames the law as proof that America is being disrespected and vows to tear up USMCA unless it's fixed. Canadian politicians, meanwhile, hold press conferences with dairy farmers standing behind them, declaring they will never surrender their right to control their own market. Caught in the middle are the farmers themselves. In the U.S., they see years of advocacy and legal battles erased by a single Canadian statute. In Canada, they see the law as a lifeline, guaranteeing stability in an unpredictable global market. The tension is building toward the 2026 USMCA review, where this dispute is certain to take center stage. Without a negotiated workaround, The two countries risk letting this single issue contaminate other areas of trade: autos, technology, cross-border energy, with consequences far beyond agriculture. And history tells us something uncomfortable. Once trade tensions escalate into tit-for-tat measures, they develop their own momentum. They become harder to contain, harder to reverse, and far more damaging than either side intended. SC 2025 C1 is more than just a line of legislation in Canada's books. It's a turning point in North American trade politics. For Canada, it's a shield, a promise to voters that dairy, poultry, and eggs will remain under Canadian control, untouched by foreign negotiators. For the United States, it's a locked gate in one of the most valuable markets its farmers have ever had. The 2026 USMCA review will test both nations. Washington will want that gate opened. Ottawa has bolted it shut. Any attempt to force the issue risks not just an agricultural clash, but a broader trade conflict spilling into autos, energy, and manufacturing. This isn't just about trade policy, it's about the lives tied to it. The dairy farmer in Wisconsin, the truck driver in Michigan, the cold storage worker in Maine all stand to gain or lose depending on what happens next. In the coming months, the choices made in Ottawa and Washington will decide whether this dispute becomes a controlled negotiation or a full-blown trade war. We'll keep following this story, because beyond the headlines and the political theater, the stakes are measured in livelihoods, communities, and the economic lifeblood of two nations that have more to lose from fighting each other than they have to gain. This is the battle for the border's breadbasket, and it's only just beginning.